Hello, dear reader. How's your day going so far? What time is it in your corner of the world? Whether you're reading from Europe, the Americas, Asia, or anywhere else on our beautiful planet, I hope this story transports you to Renaissance Florence. If you enjoy this historical tale, please consider subscribing to Timeless Tales for more immersive journeys through history's most captivating moments. The bells of Florence rang out across the Arno Valley, their bronze voices carrying over red-tiled rooftops and marble palaces. It was spring of 1492, and the city glowed golden in the late afternoon sun. In his workshop near the Ponte Vecchio, Sandro Botticelli stepped back from his canvas, squinting at the face of Venus rising from her shell. Something in her eyes troubled him, too knowing perhaps, or not knowing enough. He dipped his brush in a mixture of lapis and white lead, attempting once more to capture divinity in pigment. Across the city, in a garden overlooking Florence, Leonardo da Vinci sat hunched over a corpse. The elderly man had died that morning, and Leonardo had paid the family handsomely for this privilege. His charcoal moved swiftly, capturing the intricate patterns of veins beneath translucent skin, the perfect mechanics of a wrist joint. Beauty in death. This was Florence's genius, to find the divine in the mortal. "Maestro," his apprentice said from the doorway, "the city council has sent for you. It's about Il Magnifico." Leonardo nodded without looking up. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, had been bedridden for days. All Florence knew death approached their patron, their protector, their North Star. In the Medici palace, Lorenzo lay propped against silk pillows, his face gaunt, but his eyes still sharp. Physicians moved about the chamber with solemn faces, while priests prayed in corners. Lorenzo's children huddled together near the door: Piero, his heir, Giovanni, the future pope, and Giuliano, still a child. The family dynasty, waiting for its transfer of power. "The artists are here, my lord," a servant announced. Lorenzo smiled faintly as Botticelli, Leonardo, and Michelangelo entered. They bowed deeply to the man who had financed their genius, protected their freedom, and elevated their status from craftsmen to visionaries. "My friends," Lorenzo's voice came as a whisper, "I wish to see beauty one last time." Botticelli presented a small painting of the Madonna, her face serene and loving. Leonardo showed drawings of flying machines and anatomical studies. Young Michelangelo, not yet 20, approached with nothing in his hands. "I bring no work, my lord," he said, "only gratitude." Lorenzo nodded. "Your David will outlive us all." Despite his pain, Lorenzo turned the conversation to philosophy, quoting Plato on the immortality of the soul. This was Florence at its zenith. Death approached philosophical, art transcending religion, and man reaching toward godhood through creation. Outside the palace, Florence bustled with prosperity. In the markets, merchants displayed silks from Damascus, spices from Constantinople, and leather goods made in the city itself. Women in fine dresses sauntered with decorated mirrors hanging from their belts, their fingers adorned with rings, their necks with pearls and gold. Young men in bright, fashionable clothes strutted through piazzas, reciting poetry or discussing the latest philosophical debates from the Platonic Academy. This was the Renaissance rebirth, in its fullest flower, a civilization drunk on beauty, wealth, and its own cleverness. Bankers calculated profits while commissioning chapels to ease their consciences. Philosophers rediscovered pagan texts while genuflecting in Catholic masses. Artists painted biblical scenes with the faces of their mistress. In a humble Dominican monastery on the city's edge, a thin monk with burning eyes watched it all, with growing horror. "Brother Girolamo," a young novice said, "the prior requests your presence in the chapel." Girolamo Savonarola nodded curtly. He gathered his simple black robes and followed the novice through stone corridors. At 40, Savonarola's face was already deeply lined, his nose prominent and hooked like an eagle's beak. His eyes, those who met them never forgot, contained a fire that seemed to see through flesh to soul. In the monastery garden, the prior waited. "Brother Girolamo, I've received another complaint about your preaching." "From whom? The Medici? The bankers whose usury I condemn? The priests whose concubines I mention?" Savonarola's voice was unexpectedly powerful for his frame. "From those who fear you incite unrest," the prior said carefully. "These are delicate times. Lorenzo is dying." "And Florence's soul dies with him," Savonarola replied. "Do you not see it, brother? The paganism disguised as enlightenment, Venus and Mars in our churches. Plato preached alongside Christ as if they were equals. The Renaissance has brought great works that glorify God. The Renaissance glorifies man," Savonarola cut him off. "I have seen visions, brother. God's patience with Florence wanes. The sword of divine justice hangs over this city of vanity." The prior sighed. They had had this conversation many times. What would you have the people do? Burn their books, destroy their art, return to the darkness? Savonarola's eyes flashed. If the light blinds them to God's truth, then yes, darkness would be preferable. That night, as Florence lit its lamps and the wealthy prepared for evening entertainments, Lorenzo de' Medici breathed his last. The Magnificent was dead. The bells that had earlier celebrated the day now tolled in mourning. Florence had lost its balance. The figure who had maintained peace between competing families, between church and commerce, between artistic freedom and religious orthodoxy, was gone. In the void that followed, Savonarola rose. Caterina Rossi stood in her father's workshop, breathing in the familiar scents of leather and dye. At 22, she managed most of the business now, as her father's eyesight failed him. The Rossi family had been leather workers for generations, creating the fine gloves, belts, and the book covers that Florence exported throughout Europe. "Another order from France," she told her father, helping him into his chair. "The Duchess of Orleans wants 30 pairs of gloves dyed purple and scented with lavender." Old Alberto Rossi nodded with satisfaction. "Our fortunes rise with the cities. Your mother would have been proud to see what you've made of our humble shop." Caterina smiled, though her thoughts drifted to the sermon she had heard that morning. The strange Dominican friar had preached with such conviction about God's coming judgment on Florence's excesses. She'd gone out of curiosity. Everyone talked about the monk with the thunderous voice, but found herself unable to dismiss his words entirely. "Father," she said carefully, "have you heard this monk, Savonarola?" Alberto's face darkened. "That doom preacher? He'd have us all in sackcloth and ashes. Pay him no mind, daughter. Such men always emerge in times of uncertainty. But what if he's right? What if God is displeased with Florence's vanity? Is it vanity to create beauty? To prosper through honest work?" Alberto gestured around the workshop. "We make practical things, Caterina. Things people need." "Purple gloves for a duchess?" she asked with a small smile. "Even duchesses have cold hands," her father retorted. "Besides, that order will feed 10 Florentine families for a month." The conversation was interrupted as the workshop door opened. Marco Leone entered, removing his cap respectfully. An artist's apprentice in Botticelli's studio, Marco had been courting Caterina for nearly a year. "Good day, Master Rossi," he bowed to Alberto, then turned to Caterina with a smile. "I've come to escort you to the evening music, if you're willing." Caterina glanced at her father, who nodded approval. "Go," he said. "Florence needs its young people to celebrate life, especially now." As they walked through the streets toward the Piazza della Signoria, Caterina noticed how the city seemed subdued. Black banners hung from many windows, mourning Lorenzo. People gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. "The maestro's worried," Marco said, referring to Botticelli. "With Lorenzo gone, who will commission the great works? Who will protect us from the church's more conservative elements?" "You mean from men like Savonarola?" Caterina asked. Marco looked surprised. You know of him? I heard him preach this morning. He spoke against luxury, against pagan themes in art. Marco frowned. He's gaining followers. Even in our workshop, 2 apprentices have stopped drawing classical figures. They say it's idolatry. In the piazza, musicians had set up near the Loggia dei Lanzi. Despite the city's mourning, people gathered for the comfort of familiar pleasures. Lutes and viols created a bubble of beauty in the twilight air. As they listened, a commotion arose from the far side of the square. A procession entered, led by black-robed Dominican monks. At their centre walked Savonarola, his cowl thrown back to reveal his severe features. The music faltered as the monks began to sing a hymn, not the complex harmonies of Renaissance composition, but an ancient, spare Gregorian chant. The contrast was stark, medieval devotion confronting Renaissance sophistication. Savonarola stopped in the centre of the piazza. Without introduction, he began to speak, his voice carrying effortlessly across the square. Florence, city of flowers or city of sin? You mourn your magnificent Lorenzo, but do you mourn your own souls? While you adorn yourselves with gold, Christ wears a crown of thorns. While you gaze upon pagan nakedness in paintings, Christ hangs naked on the cross for your salvation. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some turned away, but many moved closer, drawn by the friar's passionate conviction. I have seen visions, Savonarola continued, his voice rising. A black cross rises over Rome, signifying God's anger. A golden cross appears over Jerusalem, representing hope for the faithful. Choose, Florence. Which cross will you follow? The darkness of worldly pleasure, or the light of holy sacrifice? Marco took Caterina's hand. Let's go somewhere else. But Caterina found herself unable to move, transfixed by the monk's intensity. Something in his certainty called to a doubt within her own heart. Had Florence's beauty become decadence? Had art's celebration of the human form crossed into idolatry? I have seen the sword of God. Savonarola raised his arms to the darkening sky. It hangs over this city, ready to fall. Repent, Florence. Cast away your vanities before they drag you into hellfire. As night fell completely, torches illuminated the piazza. Their light caught the tears on Savonarola's face. He wept as he condemned, loved as he threatened. This paradox gave his words a power that mere hectoring could never achieve. When the sermon ended, the crowd dispersed in silence. The musicians had long since packed away their instruments. He speaks as if he truly sees what others don't, Caterina said quietly as they walked home. Marco's face was troubled. That's what makes him dangerous. Over the next 2 years, Florence changed. Lorenzo's son, Piero de' Medici, proved a poor successor, lacking his father's diplomatic skill and cultural vision. The French king, Charles VIII, invaded Italy, and Piero's mishandling of the crisis led to the Medici family's expulsion from Florence. Into the power vacuum stepped Savonarola, whose prophecies of foreign invasion seemed fulfilled by the French army. Though he held no official political position, his moral authority transformed him into Florence's de facto ruler. He advocated for a popular government, a republic guided by God's law as interpreted through his visions. In Botticelli's workshop, the changes were evident. The master himself, once the painter of the Birth of Venus and Primavera, now focused almost exclusively on religious themes. His brushwork remained exquisite, but the joyous celebration of beauty had been replaced by austere devotion. Marco found himself torn. As an artist, he cherished the Renaissance ideals of humanism and classical beauty. But as a Florentine citizen in increasingly fanatic times, he felt the pressure to conform. The maestro burned some of his earlier sketches yesterday, Marco told Caterina, as they walked along the Arno River one winter afternoon in 1496. Studies of nude figures from mythology. Caterina gasped. He destroyed his own work. Marco nodded grimly. He said they were occasions of sin. He kicked a stone into the water. This isn't the Florence I apprenticed in. Art should elevate the soul through beauty, not terrify it with judgment. Caterina's own business had suffered as well. The export of luxury goods had declined sharply under Savonarola's influence. Simple, unadorned leather was still in demand, but the decorative work that showed Florentine craftsmanship at its finest, the gold-stamped book covers, the embroidered gloves, the jewel-studded belts, these were now denounced as vanities. Father is worried we'll have to dismiss half our workers by spring, she said. People still need leather goods, but none dare display wealth openly anymore. They stopped at a point where the river widened. The setting sun turned the water to bronze, the same colour as the great Ghiberti doors of the baptistery that Michelangelo had called the Gates of Paradise. "Will you attend the carnival festivities next month?" Marco asked suddenly. Caterina looked surprised. "Will there be any? I thought Savonarola had forbidden such pagan celebrations." "That's just it," Marco lowered his voice, though no one was near. "He's not forbidding it. He's transforming it. Instead of the usual masks and dancing, he's organising what he calls Bonfire of the Vanities. People are meant to throw luxuries, artworks, anything he deems occasions of sin into a great fire in the piazza." "And you want to attend this purge?" Caterina asked incredulously. "I want to witness it," Marco said. "To remember, one day. When this badness passes, someone must be able to tell what Florence did to itself." Caterina touched his face gently. "Be careful, my love. These are dangerous times to be an observer rather than a believer." In his sparse cell at the monastery of San Marco, Girolamo Savonarola knelt in prayer. The stone floor had worn smooth beneath his knees over the years, polished by faith and fear. Outside, Florence slept uneasily beneath winter stars, a city transformed by his vision, or so he believed. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength for what must be done. The purification is not complete." 2 years had passed since Lorenzo's death, since the Medici expulsion, since his ascendancy. 2 years of preaching against wealth, against sensuality in art, against corruption in the church itself. 2 years of gathering followers, his piagnoni or weepers, who patrolled Florence's streets, monitoring behaviour, reporting transgressions. Many had embraced his vision of a new Jerusalem, a Florence purified of worldliness. Children especially had responded to his call, forming brigades that went door to door, collecting vanities for destruction. Young boys who once would have been apprenticed to artists or bankers now trained as moral soldiers in Savonarola's army of righteousness. Not everyone approved. The wealthy merchants saw their profits diminish as luxury trade suffered. Artists found commissions scarce for all but the most pious subjects. And in Rome, Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, watched with growing concern as Savonarola's influence expanded. A knock at his cell door interrupted Savonarola's prayers. "Enter," he called. Fra Domenico, his most loyal follower, stepped inside. "Brother Girolamo, the preparations for the carnival are complete. The platform has been built in the piazza." Savonarola nodded. "Good. This carnival will honour God, not mock him. No more pagan revelry in Christian Florence." "There is other news," Fra Domenico said hesitantly. "Another letter has arrived from Rome. The Pope demands you cease preaching and come to Rome to explain yourself." Savonarola's thin lips tightened. Alexander Borgia is no true pope. He bought the papal throne with Spanish gold and sleeps with courtesans in the Vatican itself. I answer to a higher authority. "Brother, the people fear excommunication." "Let them fear God more." Savonarola rose from his knees. "The church needs reform from root to branch. If this puts me at odds with Rome, so be it." Fra Domenico looked troubled. "There are rumours that some Franciscans challenge your revelations." Brother Mariano has offered to submit himself to trial by fire to prove you false." "Theatrical tricks," Savonarola dismissed the challenge. "God reveals truth through prophecy and its fulfillment, not through circus spectacles." Yet as Fra Domenico left, Savonarola returned to his prie-dieu with a heavier heart than he would admit. Doubt, the eternal shadow of the prophet, whispered at the edges of his conviction. Were his visions truly divine? Was Florence truly transforming into the New Jerusalem he envisioned, or was he merely replacing one form of corruption with another? He shook his head violently as if to dislodge such thoughts. "Get thee behind me!" he muttered. Outside his window, dawn began to break over Florence. The city that had once been the crown jewel of the Renaissance now stood at a crossroads of its own making. Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippi, known to the world as Sandro Botticelli, stood in his workshop contemplating the unfinished painting before him. Once his brush had flowed with sensuous lines, creating Venus rising from the sea foam, the three Graces dancing in diaphanous gowns, nymphs and satyrs celebrating spring's return. Now he painted the crucifixion, again. At 52, Botticelli found himself increasingly drawn to Savonarola's vision of art as a vehicle for devotion rather than delight. The monk's condemnation of pagan themes had struck a chord within him, a latent guilt over having used his God-given talent to celebrate worldly beauty rather than divine truth. "Master," his apprentice Marco approached cautiously. "The pigments you requested have arrived." Botticelli nodded without turning. "Mix the ultramarine for Christ's robe, sparingly. It costs more than gold." Marco began grinding the precious lapis lazuli stone. "Will you attend the bonfire tomorrow?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Now Botticelli turned, his expression unreadable. "Brother Girolamo has asked me to attend. He says my presence will encourage others." "And will you contribute anything to the flames?" The master's eyes returned to his painting. "What we sacrifice matters less than that we are willing to sacrifice." Marco's hand stilled over the mortar and pestle. "Master, your paintings have brought beauty into the world. They elevate the soul, or trap it in materiality," Botticelli cut him off. "I have painted too many Venuses, too many pagan fables. Perhaps Brother Girolamo is right. Perhaps such images do lead the weak astray. But your gift, my gift, comes from God and should glorify him alone." Botticelli's tone softened as he looked at his troubled apprentice. "You're young, Marco. You haven't yet felt the weight of mortality pressing on your soul, demanding an accounting of your life's work." That evening, Marco sought out Caterina. He found her in the family workshop, carefully packing away their finest leather goods, not for a customer, but for safekeeping. "Father believes this madness must pass eventually," she explained, wrapping a jewelled book cover in linen. "When it does, people will want beautiful things again." Marco helped her secure the bundles in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "Botticelli is attending the bonfire tomorrow. I fear he may destroy some of his own works." Caterina straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "You can't stop him. Each soul must find its own path." "Even if that path leads to destruction? Florence is consuming itself, Caterina. Our greatest treasures, burned by our own hands." She touched his cheek gently. "And what of your soul, Marco? Where does your path lead?" He covered her hand with his own. "I don't know anymore. I believe in God, but I also believe in beauty. Must they be enemies?" Their moment was interrupted by a commotion in the street. Looking out, they saw a procession of children marching past. Savonarola's child militia, boys no older than 12 or 13, carrying wooden crosses and singing psalms. They stopped at neighbouring houses, knocking on doors, demanding entry to search for vanities. "There are coming sir," Caterina whispered, glancing at the floor where their treasures lay hidden. "I'll distract them," Marco decided. "Close up here and go out the back way." Before she could protest, he slipped into the street, approaching the leader of the young brigade, a boy of perhaps 14 with the fervent eyes of the truly convinced. "God's blessing on you, brothers," Marco called cheerfully. "I've just come from the monastery. Brother Girolamo has asked for all brigades to gather in the Piazza San Marco for new instructions." The boy looked suspicious. "He told us to search this street." "Plans change," Marco shrugged. "Oh, but if you doubt me, by all means, continue here while the others receive his new wisdom." This sowed enough confusion that the boys fell to arguing among themselves. In the meantime, Marco saw Caterina slip out the back of the workshop, a canvas bundle under her arm. Later they met at his small lodgings near the cathedral. "That was foolish," she scolded. "What if they had questioned you further?" "Then I would have been arrested for obstruction, not heresy," he replied, helping her conceal the bundle beneath his bed. The smaller sin. They stood close in the cramped room, the tension of the moment binding them. Without planning it, they found themselves in an embrace, her head against his chest, his chin resting on her hair. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Whatever comes tomorrow or after, let's face it, together." She looked up, surprised not by the proposal but by its timing. "You choose now, with the city tearing itself apart." "Especially now," he said. "Love is an act of faith, Caterina. Faith in the future. Faith that beauty and joy will outlast fear and fanaticism." Her answer was a kiss, quick, almost furtive, but certain. "Yes," she said against his lips, though God knows what kind of Florence we'll inherit. "God knows," Marco agreed, though I sometimes wonder if he tells Savonarola as much as the friar believes. February 7th, 1497, Shrove Tuesday, the final day before Lent's austerities began, dawned cold and clear in Florence. In the Piazza della Signoria, workers had constructed a massive pyramid-like structure, 15 braccia high, nearly 30 feet, with 7 tiers symbolising the 7 deadly sins. At its base lay pride, followed by envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, greed, and at the very top sloth. By mid-morning, Savonarola's followers began bringing vanities to feed the coming flames, playing cards, dice, chess sets, musical instruments, fine clothing, wigs, mirrors, cosmetics, perfumes, pagan books, sensual paintings, sculptures of mythological figures, anything associated with luxury or worldly pleasure. Marco arrived early, positioning himself where he could observe without being prominent. He watched as city officials supervised the arrangement of the items, cataloguing Florence's treasures, even as they prepared to destroy them. A group of noble women approached, led by a matron in a severe black dress. They carried baskets containing jewellery, fine fabrics, and perfume bottles. With solemn ceremony, they added these to the growing pile, receiving blessings from Dominican monks who stood nearby. Children came next, Savonarola's brigades marching in formation, singing hymns as they deposited confiscated items, dolls with painted faces, toy weapons, illustrated books of fables deemed too fanciful for pure young minds. The crowd swelled as noon approached. Marco spotted Botticelli standing with a group of artists near the Loggia dei Lanzi. The master's face was drawn, his eyes hollow. Under his arm he carried a wrapped canvas. Marco pushed through the crowd toward him. "Master Botticelli," he called. The painter turned, recognition flickering in his tired eyes. "Marco, you've come to witness Florence's transformation." "I've come to witness Florence's madness," Marco replied quietly. "Please, master, don't contribute to it. Whatever you've brought is mine to offer or keep," Botticelli finished firmly. "You've been a good apprentice, Marco, but some journeys the soul must make alone." Before Marco could respond, a murmur passed through the crowd. Savonarola had arrived, accompanied by his closest followers. The friar looked gaunt but energised, his dark eyes taking in the massive pyramid of vanities with evident satisfaction. He mounted a small platform and raised his hands for silence. The square, packed with thousands, grew still. "Florence," His powerful voice carried to every corner of the piazza. Today you stand at the threshold of salvation. For too long this city has worshipped false idols, beauty without purpose, art without devotion, and pleasure without godliness. Today we cleanse ourselves. A cheer rose from his supporters. Others watched in uneasy silence. Let the merchants who have profited from vanity now profit from virtue. Let the artists who have painted pagan gods now glorify the true God. Let Florence, once the jewel of worldly renaissance, become the crown of spiritual rebirth. As if on cue, 2 Dominican monks approached the pyramid with torches. Savonarola raised his crucifix high. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, he intoned. Let the fire of divine justice purify our city. The monks touched their torches to the base of the pyramid. Flames licked at playing cards and chess pieces, caught on silks and perfumed papers, climbed toward cosmetics and mirrors. Black smoke billowed upward. Marco heard a woman sob nearby. Turning, he saw an elderly musician watching her lute catch fire, its elegant neck already blackening. Her life's companion surrendered to the flames. The fire grew, feeding on centuries of human craftsmanship. The heat became intense, forcing the crowd to step back. Marco searched for Botticelli and saw him approach the fire, unwrapping his canvas. "No," Marco whispered, pushing forward, but the press of bodies held him back. Botticelli stood at the edge of the flames, holding what appeared to be a small painting, not one of his major works perhaps, but one of his hand nonetheless. For a moment he hesitated, looking into the painted eyes one last time. Then Savonarola was beside him, a hand on his shoulder, leaning to whisper in his ear. Whatever was said, it resolved the painter's hesitation. With a visible sigh, Botticelli cast the painting onto the fire. A cheer rose from the zealots in the crowd. Florence's most celebrated living artist had sacrificed his own work to the cause. If Botticelli could burn beauty, who could justify clinging to lesser treasures? The example sparked a frenzy. People rushed forward with additional offerings: fine shoes, decorated manuscripts, small sculptures. The pyramid, already ablaze, could scarcely accommodate more. But still they came, caught in collective madness. Through the chaos, Marco spotted Caterina across the square. Their eyes met over the sea of fervent faces, over the smoke of burning beauty. In that moment, they were islands of sanity in an ocean of zealotry, clinging to a shared understanding that this day would mark Florence forever. As evening fell, the fire reached its peak. Against the darkening sky, flames shot 30 feet high, casting a hellish glow over the faces of the watchers. The heat melted gold from picture frames, shattered glass mirrors, reduced priceless manuscripts to ash. The smell was acrid, burning hair from wigs, melting wax, scorching leather, and beneath it all, the sweet sickly odour of incinerating pigments, many containing mercury, arsenic and lead. Savonarola watched with evident satisfaction, his gaunt face illuminated by the flames. This was his vision manifest. Florence purging itself of worldly attachments, embracing the austere path to salvation. In the fire's roar he heard divine approval. Not everyone shared his interpretation. At the edge of the square, foreign merchants and ambassadors observed with calculation in their eyes, assessing Florence's self-inflicted wound. Representatives from Venice, Genoa and Milan, rival city-states that had watched Florence's artistic dominance with envy, now witnessed its voluntary abdication from cultural leadership. The Pope's representative took careful note of who participated most enthusiastically. Alexander VI had not forgotten Savonarola's insults, his calls for church reform, his defiance of papal authority. The bonfire was more than cultural destruction. It was political rebellion draped in religious fervour. As the flames began to subside, leaving a mountain of embers and ash in the heart of Florence, the crowd slowly dispersed. Some walked away with the light step of the unburdened, believing they had sacrificed mere objects to save their immortal souls. Others moved heavily, already feeling the weight of regret for irreplaceable treasures surrendered to mob hysteria. Marco searched through the dispersing crowd until he found Katerina. Wordlessly they embraced, holding each other, while the last flames flickered and died behind them. "It's done," she whispered. "Florence has burned its heart." "Not all of it," Marco replied. "Not yours and mine. Not what we've hidden away. Someday this will pass." They made their way through darkened streets, past shuttered workshops and so quiet homes. The smell of smoke followed them, inescapable. It clung to their clothing, their hair, seeming to penetrate the very stones of Florence. At her father's house, Katerina paused before entering. "What happens now? Will one bonfire satisfy him?" Marco looked back toward the distant glow still visible above the rooftops. "I fear this is only the beginning." For a time it seemed Savonarola's vision of a purified Florence might endure. His followers, the Piagnoni, controlled the city government. His sermons drew ever larger crowds. His moral reforms became city ordinances, laws against gambling, prostitution, public drunkenness, immodest dress, and usury. The city that had been the epicenter of Renaissance splendor now embraced austerity. Artists who had once depicted Greek gods and goddesses now confined themselves to biblical subjects. Workshops that had produced luxury goods now created simple functional items. Scholars who had celebrated classical literature now focused exclusively on scripture and church fathers. In his monastery cell, Savonarola should have rejoiced in this transformation. Instead, he found himself increasingly plagued by doubt and external pressure. Pope Alexander VI, furious at Savonarola's continued defiance, excommunicated him in May 1497, forbidding him to preach and threatening to place all Florence under interdict, a punishment that would deny the sacraments to every citizen. Political winds shifted as well. The French king, whose invasion Savonarola had correctly prophesied, withdrew from Italy. Without this external threat, Florentines began questioning the need for such extreme moral vigilance. Merchants, suffering from economic decline as luxury trades collapsed, grew restless under Savonarola's restrictions. Perhaps most damaging, the promised divine interventions, God's reward for Florence's purification, failed to materialize. No miraculous prosperity replaced worldly trade. No divine protection shielded the city from political pressures. The New Jerusalem remained stubbornly human, with all the associated failings. Fra Domenico found Savonarola praying in the monastery garden one April morning in 1498, 14 months after the great bonfire. "Brother Girolamo," he said urgently, "there's trouble in the city. The Signoria has called for a trial by fire." Savonarola looked up, his face even more gaunt than before. Months of fasting and night vigils had reduced him to a living skeleton. "Explain." "A Franciscan friar has challenged your prophecies," Fra Domenico continued. "He says if you are truly God's messenger, God will protect you or one of your followers from being burned. The Signoria has approved the test." "Theatrics," Savonarola dismissed it. "God does not perform on demand like a street conjurer." "The people expect it," Fra Domenico pressed. "If you refuse, they'll say you fear the outcome." "And if I accept, I tempt God," Savonarola countered. "There is no winning in this challenge." Yet he understood the precariousness of his position. Power built on prophetic authority could vanish like morning mist when prophecies failed to manifest. "I will not go myself," Savonarola decided. "But if you're willing, Fra Domenico," his loyal follower knelt. "I would walk through fire for God's truth." The trial was set for April 7th, 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria, the same space where the bonfire of the Vanities had consumed Florence's treasures the previous year. Now it would test the prophet himself. On the appointed day, thousands gathered in the piazza. 2 parallel walkways had been constructed, piled high with kindling and oil-soaked wood. The plan, representatives from both the Dominican and Franciscan orders, would walk through the flames simultaneously. Whoever emerged unburned would prove their cause divinely favoured. Marco and Caterina stood among the crowd, their engagement now public, their wedding planned for summer, if Florence survived its current madness. "This is barbaric," Caterina whispered, as officials inspected the wood piles. "It's the logical conclusion of Savonarola's Florence," Marco replied grimly. "When beauty and reason are cast aside, only spectacle remains." The crowd grew restless as the morning lengthened into afternoon with no sign of fire. Arguments broke out between Dominicans and Franciscans over procedural details. Could Fra Domenico carry a crucifix through the flames? Must he remove his robes first, as potentially treated with fire-resistant substances? Rain clouds gathered overhead, as if heaven itself hesitated to witness such a test. Finally, as evening approached with no resolution, the Signoria cancelled the trial. The crowd's disappointment turned to anger. Some blamed Savonarola for the delay, seeing cowardice where once they had seen conviction. That night, the city erupted. Opponents of Savonarola's rule, long silent through fear, took to the streets chanting "Abbasso il frate!" "Down with the friar!" They marched on the monastery of San Marco, where Savonarola and his followers had barricaded themselves. "They're coming for him," Marco told Caterina as they heard the mob approaching their quarter. "The fever has broken." "And will a new madness replace it?" she asked. The siege of San Marco lasted through the night. By morning, city officials, many formerly loyal to Savonarola but now sensing the changing winds, arrived with orders for his arrest. The prophet surrendered without resistance. What followed was predictable. Torture, confession, recantation, more torture. The same civic machinery that had elevated Savonarola now methodically destroyed him. After 6 weeks of suffering, he was convicted of heresy, sedition, and religious innovation. On May 23rd, 1498, Girolamo Savonarola was hanged and then burned in the Piazza della Signoria, exactly where the bonfire of the vanities had occurred, exactly where the trial by fire had been abandoned. Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro, his closest followers, shared his fate. Marco and Caterina watched from a distance as the prophet's body blackened in the flames. "God's judgment," murmured some in the crowd. "Man's revenge," countered others. As the smoke dissipated, carried away by a spring breeze, something shifted in Florence. The city had consumed its consumer of beauty and found the taste bitter. 5 years later, in the summer of 1503, Marco stood in his own workshop near the Arno River. No longer an apprentice but a master in his own right, he studied the nearly complete painting on his easel, a Madonna and Child, serene yet human, rendered with technical skill that even Botticelli might have approved. Behind him the door opened quietly and Caterina entered, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia balanced on her hip. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring the painting. "Is it for the Gonzaga Commission?" Marco nodded, stepping back to assess his work. "They're a chapel in Mantua, far from Florence, but the payment is generous." "Florence's loss is Mantua's gain," Caterina said, setting Sophia down to play with a wooden doll. "Though things are changing here too, slowly." Indeed, 5 years after Savonarola's execution, Florence was rediscovering its artistic soul. The Medici remained in exile, but the Republic had stabilised. Trade revived. Artists found patrons again, though many, like the young Michelangelo, had sought opportunity elsewhere during the dark years. Botticelli had survived, but never fully recovered. Now in his late 50s, he painted rarely, his hand less certain, his subjects exclusively religious. The fire in the piazza had consumed more than physical vanities. It had burned away something essential in Florence's greatest artists. That evening, Marco and Caterina walked along the Arno with Sophia running ahead, chasing butterflies in the golden light. They passed the workshop of an elderly leather worker who nodded respectfully. This was Alberto Rossi, Caterina's father, still producing the fine goods that had once been his pride. Father says orders are increasing again, Caterina remarked. A cardinal from Rome wants embossed leather for his library. The pendulum swings back, Marco said. Perhaps never to the heights of Lorenzo's time, but away from Savonarola's abyss. They stopped at the spot where, years before, they had watched the sunset together, and first spoken of the coming bonfire. The river flowed on, indifferent to human folly. "Do you remember what you asked me that day?" Caterina said quietly. "Is it vanity to create beauty?" Marco smiled, watching his daughter twirl in simple joy. "And now I know the answer. Beauty is not vanity. It's necessity, as essential as bread." He put his arm around his wife. Savonarola's mistake was seeing beauty as the enemy of God rather than another path to him. In Florence, the Duomo's dome still dominated the skyline. Inside the cathedral, paintings that had escaped the flames still illuminated biblical stories for the faithful. In the Uffizi, portraits preserved the faces of those long dead. In workshops throughout the city, apprentices learned from masters, carrying tradition forward. The bonfire had not consumed all of Florence's beauty. It had merely revealed how precious, how essential that beauty was. As twilight deepened into evening, lights appeared in windows across the city, the same windows where black banners had once hung mourning Lorenzo, where Savonarola's followers had placed candles signalling their devotion. Now these lights simply marked homes, families, life continuing. "We should go home," Caterina said, lifting a sleepy Sophia into her arms. "Tomorrow comes early." "Tomorrow always does," Marco agreed. They walked back through streets where vanities had burned and prophets had fallen, where Renaissance had faltered but never quite died. Their footsteps echoed on stones that had witnessed humanity's eternal struggle between extremes, beauty and austerity, freedom and control, creation and destruction. Florence had survived its own bonfire, damaged, changed, but still Florence, still creating, still believing in the power of human hands to make beauty from base materials, still reaching through that beauty towards something divine. In the decades that followed, artists like Michelangelo, Raphael and Leonardo would create works that defined Renaissance mastery. Yet those who had witnessed the bonfire of the vanities never forgot its lesson. That civilizations can choose to burn what makes them civilized, that humans can destroy what makes them human. The scent of smoke lingered in Florence's memory long after the flames died away, a warning that beauty, once surrendered to fear, leaves only ashes in its place. Hello, dear reader. How's your day going so far? What time is it where you are right now? I'm always curious where in the world our stories are being read. Whether you're enjoying this over morning coffee in New York, during an afternoon break in London, or as an evening read in Sydney. Wherever you are, thank you for joining us on another journey through history with Timeless Tales. If you enjoy this story of power, faith and betrayal from medieval England, please consider subscribing to Timeless Tales for more historical narratives that bring the past vividly to life. Now, let us travel back to the 12th century, to cold stone walls and the deadly clash between church and crown. Canterbury, December the 29th, 1170. Thomas Becket knelt alone before the altar of St. Benedict in Canterbury Cathedral, his prayer beads clicking softly through weathered fingers. Outside, winter darkness had descended early, bringing with it a bitter cold that penetrated even the thick stone walls of God's house. The cathedral was eerily quiet, save for the distant chanting of monks at vespers and the occasional gust of wind that made the candles flicker, casting long shadows across the ancient floor. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Becket had grown accustomed to these solitary moments of reflection, cherishing them as respite from the storm that had become his life. Yet tonight, something felt different. A heaviness hung in the air, an unspoken premonition that caused his heart to beat faster beneath his woolen robes. "My lord," he whispered, "grant me the strength for what is to come." His thoughts drifted unwillingly to a time that seemed like another life, when he had been Chancellor of England and the King's most trusted friend. How different things had been then. How simple. London, 1154. "Thomas, for God's sake, drink up. The night is young and there are ladies waiting." King Henry II, not yet 30 but already the most powerful monarch in Christendom, slammed down his goblet and wiped wine from his reddish-gold beard. His eyes sparkled with a particular intensity that both charmed and intimidated those around him. Tall and broad-shouldered, the Plantagenet king dominated any room he entered through sheer force of personality as much as royal authority. Across the table, Thomas Becket, 15 years the king's senior, smiled indulgently. Refined where Henry was rough, calculating where Henry was impulsive, the Chancellor made a curious companion for the young king. Yet their friendship was the talk of the court. "Your Majesty thinks of nothing but pleasure," Becket replied, though he lifted his cup in acquiescence. "And you think of nothing but business," Henry retorted. "That's why we complement each other so well. I rule with my heart, you rule with your head." The great hall of Westminster Palace buzzed with life around them, nobles and ladies dancing, minstrels playing, servants rushing with platters of food and pitchers of wine, a celebration for Henry's latest victory over rebel barons in Normandy. "To England," Henry said, raising his goblet again, "and to the man who runs it while I'm away fighting." They drank together, and Becket felt that peculiar warmth that came not from the wine but from Henry's approval. The king leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I have plans, Thomas, grand plans. England will be a nation of law and order, not subject to the whims of local lords or," he paused meaningfully, "meddling bishops." "The church has its place, your Majesty," Becket said carefully. Henry waved his hand dismissively. "The church serves two masters, Rome and England. I intend to ensure it remembers which one feeds it." Becket nodded non-committally. As Chancellor, he had helped Henry assert royal authority over rebellious nobles, centralise justice, and fill the royal coffers. But the church remained a separate power, with its own courts and laws, a thorn in Henry's side. "I will need a new Archbishop of Canterbury soon," Henry said suddenly, eyeing his friend speculatively. "Old Theobald cannot last much longer." Becket stiffened slightly. "I'm sure your Majesty will find a suitable successor." Henry laughed, clapping Becket on the shoulder with enough force to make him wince. "Oh, I already have, old friend. When Theobald passes, the mitre is yours." "Mine?" Becket's carefully composed face betrayed genuine shock. "Your Majesty jests. I am no churchman." precisely why you're perfect. You're loyal to me, not to Rome." "But I enjoy the pleasures of court life too much," Becket protested, gesturing at his fine silk clothes and the gold rings adorning his fingers. "I would make a poor example of piety." Henry's gaze hardened slightly, the smile remaining but the warmth behind it cooling. "When the time comes, you'll accept. For England. For me." Later that night, as Becket returned to his chambers, his steward Gilbert handed him a sealed message that had arrived during the feast. "From Canterbury, my lord." Becket broke the seal and read the brief message. Archbishop Theobald had taken a turn for the worse. The physicians gave him days, perhaps hours. Looking out his window at the moonlit Thames, Becket felt a strange foreboding. Henry would have his way. He always did. But something deep within warned him that the Archbishop's robes would change him in ways the king could never anticipate. Canterbury, 1162. By the authority vested in me, I pronounce and declare you Thomas Becket to be Archbishop of Canterbury, primate of all England. The words echoed through the vast cathedral as the papal legate placed the ceremonial pallium around Becket's shoulders. The weight of the simple wool band felt heavier than any golden chain of office he had worn as Chancellor. Just the day before, Becket had been ordained as a priest, an unprecedented rush to prepare him for the archbishopric. Now, beneath the soaring arches of Canterbury Cathedral, surrounded by bishops, nobles and common folk alike, he felt a profound shift within himself, as if God's hand had reached inside and rearranged his very soul. Henry watched from his place of honour, a satisfied smile playing across his lips. His plan was coming to fruition. His loyal Chancellor would now be his loyal Archbishop, bringing the Church to heel under royal authority. How wrong he was. After the ceremony, Henry approached his friend, embracing him warmly. "Archbishop," he said, the word dripping with satisfaction. "England now has one head and one heart." Becket met the king's gaze steadily. "I pray I may be worthy of God's trust in me." "And mine," Henry added pointedly. "I must serve God first, my liege," Becket replied softly, "even before my king." Henry's smile faltered for just a moment before he laughed. "Always so serious, Thomas. Come, let us feast. Tomorrow there will be time enough for business." But when tomorrow came, Henry found a changed man. Becket, who had once dressed more lavishly than the king himself, now wore a simple monk's habit beneath his official robes. The man who had enjoyed hunting and carousing with Henry now ate sparingly and spent hours in prayer. Most shocking of all, he had resigned his position as Chancellor. "What is the meaning of this?" Henry demanded when Becket presented him with the royal seal. "I cannot serve two masters fully, your majesty. The Church requires my complete devotion." Henry's face darkened. "I elevated you to this position, Thomas. I expected your continued support. And you shall have it, my liege, in all things that do not conflict with my duty to God." "They need not conflict if you don't wish them to," Henry said tightly. Becket's expression was serene but firm. "I fear that is not for me to decide." That night, as Henry raged to his courtiers about ingratitude and betrayal, Bishop Gilbert Folliot, who had coveted the archbishopric for himself, offered a prophecy that would prove all too accurate. "You have worked a miracle, sire," the bishop said. "You have transformed a worldly man into a saint, and saints, I fear, make troublesome servants. Clarendon Palace, 1164. Sign it, Thomas. End this foolishness now." Henry's voice was dangerously quiet as he pointed to the parchment laid out on the great table. Around them, the assembled bishops and barons of England watched in tense silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the great hall of Clarendon Palace. The document before them, what would come to be known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, represented everything Henry had been working toward. Royal control over church courts, limitations on appeals to Rome, the requirement that church officials answer to royal justice for secular crimes. And Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, stood alone in opposition. "I cannot," Becket said simply. Cannot, Henry's voice rose sharply, or will not. Both, your majesty. These constitutions would make the church a vassal of the crown. I cannot, in good conscience, allow that to happen. Henry's face flushed crimson. Good conscience? Where was your good conscience when you were my chancellor, enforcing these very same principles? I was wrong then, Becket admitted. God has shown me the error of those ways. A vein pulsed visibly at Henry's temple. God? Or ambition? Perhaps you fancy yourself a power to rival mine now, Thomas. I am but a servant of the true power, my liege. For a moment it seemed Henry might strike the archbishop. Instead he turned to the other churchmen present. And the rest of you? Will you defy your king as well? One by one the bishops looked away, mumbled apologies, and stepped forward to sign the document. Only Becket remained unmoved. Henry smiled coldly. It seems God speaks differently to you than to your brothers, Thomas. The confrontation at Clarendon marked the point of no return. In the months that followed, Henry pursued his former friend with the full power of the crown, demanding exorbitant repayment of funds from Becket's time as Chancellor, subjecting him to humiliating trials, threatening imprisonment. And when Becket finally fled England under cover of darkness in November 1164, crossing the Channel in a small fishing boat to seek refuge in France, Henry seized all his properties and banished his family and supporters. The once brothers were now the bitterest of enemies. Normandy, 1170, 1 month before the murder. He excommunicated my bishops, Henry roared, hurling a goblet across the room where it shattered against the stone wall, sending wine spraying like blood. The royal council chamber in Buras Castle had been witness to many of Henry's infamous rages over the years, but few as violent as this. 6 years of conflict with Becket had frayed the king's formidable self-control to its limits. 3 of them. 3, he continued, pacing like a caged lion, for doing nothing but obeying their king in my son's coronation. Baron Richard du Homay, one of Henry's oldest confidants, ventured a response. Archbishop Thomas claims they usurped Canterbury's traditional right to crown the new king, sire. Canterbury's right? Henry spun around, eyes blazing. Everything is by my right. I am the king. The issue at hand was yet another battle in the long war between Henry and his former friend. The king had arranged for his son, the young Prince Henry, to be crowned as co-ruler, a common practice to secure succession. But he had deliberately had the Archbishop of York perform the ceremony, denying Becket his traditional privilege. Becket, still in exile in France despite recent peace overtures, had responded by excommunicating the bishops involved, with the tacit approval of Pope Alexander III. The French king shelters him still, Henry muttered. Louis enjoys seeing me tormented by my own archbishop. William de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, cleared his throat. There is talk of an interdict, your majesty. The room fell silent. An interdict would mean the suspension of all religious services throughout Henry's domains. No masses, no marriages, no proper burials. For a medieval population to whom salvation was an ever-present concern, it would be devastating. He wouldn't dare, Henry whispered, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Peace might still be possible, suggested Reginald Fitzurse, a rising knight in Henry's household, if your majesty were to meet with the archbishop. Henry stared out the narrow window at the Norman countryside, his lands that stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, the most powerful realm in Europe, held hostage by one stubborn priest. Arrange it, he said finally. One last chance for Thomas to remember who placed the mitre on his ungrateful head. Vrétéval, July 1170. They met on neutral ground in a meadow near Vrétéval, on the border between Norman and French territories. When Becket first caught sight of Henry riding toward the meeting place, his heart constricted painfully. 6 years had aged the king. The reddish hair was now streaked with grey, the once boundless energy tempered by the strains of ruling a vast empire constantly threatened by rebellion and intrigue. For his part, Henry barely recognised the austere figure awaiting him. The Thomas Becket, who had once been the most worldly man at court, now looked every inch the ascetic archbishop in simple robes, his once pampered face weathered by years of monastic discipline. What followed was both political negotiation and personal drama, a complex dance between two men who had once known each other better than brothers, now separated by a chasm of principle and pride. "You look well, Thomas," Henry said, making a visible effort at civility. "God has sustained me in exile, your majesty, and you have repaid him by dividing his church and challenging his anointed king." Becket's face remained impassive. "I have only defended the church's ancient rights. The details of their agreement would later be debated by chroniclers, but the essence was clear. Henry would restore Becket's properties and allow him to return to England. Becket would withdraw some of his more provocative claims, though not the excommunications that had so enraged the king. As they prepared to part, Henry made one final attempt to recapture their former closeness. "We were friends once, Thomas, the best of friends." "We were, my liege. Could we not be so again?" Becket hesitated, genuine sorrow crossing his features. "I fear that bridges burned, but we can have peace." Henry's jaw tightened. "Peace, yes. Return to England, Thomas. Resume your duties. But remember this, I am watching. Always." As they rode away in opposite directions, neither man felt the closure they had sought. Rather than healing old wounds, the meeting at Freteval had merely bandaged them temporarily, leaving them to fester beneath the surface. Canterbury, December 1st, 1170. Becket's return to England in early December was marked by scenes that both moved and alarmed his enemies. Common people lined the roads from Dover to Canterbury, kneeling for his blessing, reaching to touch his robes, calling him saint and defender of the church. "It is like the entry of Christ into Jerusalem," one of his attendants remarked. "Let us pray my end is not the same," Becket replied soberly. In Canterbury, he was received with solemn ceremony, the cathedral bells ringing out to welcome home its shepherd after 6 long years. But even as he celebrated Mass beneath the soaring arches of his church, Becket knew the conflict was far from resolved. The excommunicated bishops had fled to Normandy to plead their case with Henry. Reports reached Canterbury daily of the king's renewed fury, his vows of vengeance. On the first Sunday of Advent, Becket mounted the pulpit of Canterbury Cathedral and delivered a sermon that many would later see as prophetic. "It may be that I shall not speak to you much longer," he told the hushed congregation. "There are those who seek my life, who have threatened me many times and in many ways. I am ready to die for my Lord, that in my blood the Church may obtain liberty and peace." That night, alone in his chamber, Becket wrote a letter to be sent to the Pope in the event of his death. "I have drunk deeply of the cup of suffering," he wrote, "and I sense that I must drain it to the dregs." Bures Castle, Normandy, December 27th, 1170. What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and protected in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk? Henry's outburst came during a Christmas gathering that had been soured by the arrival of the excommunicated bishops, bearing tales of Becket's triumphant return and continued defiance. The king's face was contorted with a rage so intense that several courtiers stepped back instinctively. The great hall fell silent as the words hung in the air. Henry's eyes swept the room, settling briefly on 4 knights who stood together near the hearth: Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton. All were men who had risen through loyal service to the crown, men who owed everything to Henry's favour. No direct order was given, no explicit instruction passed from king to knights, but when Henry stormed from the hall moments later, the 4 exchanged glances laden with unspoken understanding. Late that night, as the castle slept, 4 horses were quietly led from the royal stables. 4 riders, armed and grim-faced, passed through the gates and turned toward the coast of Normandy, where ships waited to cross the wintry channel to England. Behind them, Henry tossed fitfully in his bed, his dreams haunted by the ghost of a friendship long dead. The English Channel, December the 28th, 1170. God's teeth, I've never seen such a crossing, William de Tracy gasped as another wave crashed over the bow of the small ship, drenching the already soaked nights. December storms made the Channel crossing treacherous in the best of times. Tonight it seemed as if the very elements conspired against their journey. Wind howled through the rigging, rain lashed horizontally across the deck, and the sea heaved beneath them like a dying beast. Perhaps it's an omen, Hugh de Morville suggested, his normally stolid face betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Reginald Fitzurse, the unofficial leader of the group, fixed him with a hard stare. There's no turning back now. The King's honour demands action. Richard Le Breton, youngest of the four and most eager to prove himself, nodded fervently. A priest has defied the crown once too often. England cannot have two masters. Another wave struck, sending Le Breton sprawling across the deck. De Morville helped him up, asking quietly, "What exactly do we intend to do when we reach Canterbury?" Fitzurse looked each man in the eye before answering. "Whatever is necessary. The Archbishop must withdraw the excommunications and submit to royal authority, or face the consequences." "And if he refuses?" de Tracy asked. "Then God help him," Fitzurse replied, "for we shall not." Saltwood Castle, Kent, December 29th, 1170. Morning dawn broke cold and clear over Saltwood Castle, where the four knights had taken shelter after their harrowing crossing. The castle belonged to Ranulph de Broc, a bitter enemy of Becket who had occupied church lands during the Archbishop's exile. Over a sparse breakfast, the knights finalised their plan. "We'll approach him openly," Fitzurse decided. "Demand he come to Winchester to answer to the King." "And if he refuses?" de Tracy asked again. "We take him by force," Fitzurse replied. "The King wants him alive to stand trial for his treachery." Le Breton fingered the hilt of his sword. "And if he resists?" A heavy silence fell over the table. It was de Morville who finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Let us pray it doesn't come to that." As they armed themselves and prepared to ride, de Broc provided a local guide who knew the fastest route to Canterbury and the layout of the cathedral precinct. "The Archbishop follows a strict schedule, but," de Broc told them, "Vespers at 4. He'll be in the cathedral then, with few guards nearby." Fitzurse nodded grimly. "Then that is when we shall deliver the King's justice." Canterbury, December 29th, 1170. Afternoon. Word travelled quickly through the streets of Canterbury. 4 knights of the royal household had arrived at the Archbishop's palace, demanding audience. Their manner was described as arrogant, their hands never far from their sword hilts. In his private chamber, Becket received the news with remarkable calm. "They are known to you, your grace," his clerk Alexander Llewellyn reported nervously. "Fitzurse, de Morville, de Tracy and Le Breton, all men close to the King." Becket closed the manuscript he had been studying, Augustine's City of God, and rose slowly. "I have been accepting them, or others like them," he said. "Show them into the hall. I will speak with them there." His steward, Edward Grimm, grasped his arm. "Your Grace, perhaps it would be wiser to avoid them. There is still time to seek sanctuary in the cathedral." Becket smiled sadly. "I have fled once before, Edward. I shall not run again." The meeting in the hall was tense from the first moment. The knights refused to show the customary deference to Becket's office, keeping their hats on and their expressions hostile. "We bring commands from the King," Fitzurse announced without preamble. "You're to come with us to Winchester to answer for your treasonous actions." Becket regarded them coolly. "What actions would those be, Sir Reginald?" "You know well enough. The excommunication of loyal bishops, the undermining of royal authority, the stirring of rebellion among the common people." "I have done none of these things," Becket replied. "I have merely defended the church against those who would make it a servant of the crown." De Tracy stepped forward aggressively. Will you come to Winchester or not, priest? Becket stood his ground. I am going nowhere. If the king wishes to speak with me, he knows where I am to be found. This is your final chance, Fitzurse warned. Come willingly, or we shall take you by force. Becket's gaze never wavered. No man shall lay hands on the Archbishop of Canterbury with impunity. I answer to God and the Pope, not to armed men in a king's hall. For a moment it seemed violence might erupt then and there, but Fitzurse, aware of the many witnesses present, signalled a retreat. You have made your choice, he said darkly. We shall return. As the knight stormed out, Becket's attendants rushed to him, faces pale with fear. They mean to harm you, your grace, Grim insisted. You must take refuge in the cathedral. They would not dare violate sanctuary. Becket looked toward the window, where the winter sun was already beginning its early descent. It will soon be time for vespers, he said with strange serenity. Let us prepare. Outside Canterbury Cathedral, December 29th, 1170, late afternoon. The four knights hadn't gone far. At a nearby house they donned mail hauberks beneath their cloaks and armed themselves more fully. A small group of soldiers from the royal garrison joined them, though accounts would later differ as to whether these men knew the knight's true purpose. In the gathering dusk, with the cathedral bells beginning to toll for vespers, they returned, no longer emissaries but executioners. Inside the Archbishop's palace, panic spread as servants spotted the armed men approaching the cathedral. Several monks rushed to Becket, who was preparing to enter the church. Your Grace! They come with weapons drawn! We must bar the doors! Becket paused, then shook his head. The house of God is not a fortress. Open the doors! I will not have this holy place besieged because of me. His chaplain tried one last time. My lord, they mean to kill you. Becket's face showed fear at last, but also resolve. Then I shall meet my Maker doing my duty. All my life I have been a coward, John. Perhaps in death I can find the courage that eluded me in life. With that he turned and proceeded toward the cathedral, his cross-bearer leading the way. Canterbury Cathedral, December 29th, 1170, twilight. The winter day was fading fast as Thomas Becket entered the vast, shadowy interior of Canterbury Cathedral. Behind him came a small procession of monks and cathedral staff, their worried murmurs echoing in the sacred space. Most of the monks had already gathered in the choir for vespers, their voices rising in the ancient chants of the evening office. Becket moved with measured steps through the nave, past the towering stone pillars that rose like ancient trees to support the vaulted ceiling. Candles flickered in wall sconces and hanging lamps, creating pools of golden light amid deepening shadows. He had almost reached the steps leading to the choir when the great west doors burst open with a crash that silenced the chanting. Framed in the doorway stood four armed figures, their mail glinting dully in the candlelight. Where is Thomas Becket? Traitor to the king, Fitzurse's voice rang through the cathedral. A monk near the door stepped forward bravely. There is no traitor here, only the Archbishop of Canterbury. Le Breton shoved the monk aside roughly. Then, spotting Becket near the choir steps, the knights advanced, swords half drawn. The few monks who had remained in the nave now fled toward the choir, some calling out warnings, others seeking hiding places among the side chapels. Only Edward Grim, Becket's faithful steward, remained at his side. To the altar, your Grace, Grim urged. They would not dare strike you there, but Becket stood his ground. I am here, he called to the approaching knights. What do you want of me? Fitzurse reached him first, grasping his vestments. Your life, unless you submit to the king's will immediately. I am ready to die for my lord, Becket replied, pulling free from Fitzurse's grip. But in God's name, do not harm any of these others. De Tracy moved forward menacingly. Absolve the bishops you have excommunicated. Now. I cannot go against what the Pope has approved, Becket said firmly. Then you are a dead man, de Morville growled. What happened next would be recounted in chronicles, depicted in art and retold in whispers throughout Christendom for centuries to come. The four knights, whether acting on impulse or according to a plan conceived in Normandy's shadows, drew their swords fully. Fitzurse struck first, a glancing blow to Becket's head that knocked off his cap. The Archbishop raised his hands, not in defence but in prayer. "Into thy hands, O Lord," he began. De Tracy's blade interrupted the prayer, slicing deeply into Becket's head. Grim, in a desperate attempt to protect his master, raised his arm and received a wound that nearly severed it. Becket fell to his knees, blood streaming down his face. Still conscious, he murmured, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the Church, I am ready to embrace death." The next blows came in quick succession. The Breton's sword struck with such force that it severed the top of Becket's skull and shattered against the stone floor. De Morville and Fitzurse followed with additional strikes. The final, most gruesome act came when an unnamed knight, some chronicles suggest it was Hugh MacClurk, who had accompanied the four, placed his foot on the Archbishop's neck and scooped out his brains with the point of his sword, scattering them across the cathedral floor. "This one won't get up again," he allegedly said. "Let's be away." The entire attack had taken less than a minute. In its wake, Canterbury Cathedral fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft sound of blood dripping onto stone. Then, as the knights fled into the gathering darkness outside, a single monk began to wail, a keening sound of grief and horror that was soon joined by others, until the cathedral filled with lamentation. Thomas Becket, once Chancellor of England and friend to a king, lay dead before the altar, his blood staining the sacred stones of the church he had died to defend. Canterbury Cathedral, December 29th, 1170. Night hours later, the cathedral remained a scene of horror and reverence. Word had spread through Canterbury like wildfire. The Archbishop had been murdered in his own church by the King's Knights. Common people gathered outside the cathedral gates, their crying and prayers creating a constant background to the more solemn proceedings within. Inside, the monks had recovered from their initial shock and now moved with purposeful grief. They had carefully lifted Becket's mutilated body, carrying it deeper into the cathedral to prepare it for burial. As they removed his outer garments, they made a discovery that would add to the emerging legend. Beneath his fine ecclesiastical robes, the Archbishop wore a hair shirt crawling with lice and vermin, a secret instrument of self-mortification that had been his constant companion since taking holy orders. "All these years," whispered Brother John of Salisbury, one of Becket's closest confidants, "he suffered in silence." The monks washed the body with reverence, trying to make sense of the savagery they had witnessed. Brother Gervase, the cathedral chronicler, broke down weeping as he collected some of the scattered brain matter and blood in a basin. "This is sacred," he choked out. "This is the blood of a martyr." Already, even in these first hours, the transformation had begun. From murdered archbishop to holy martyr. In death, Thomas Becket would wield more influence over king and kingdom than he ever had in life. Outside in the darkness, the four knights rode hard for Saltwood Castle, then on to Knaresborough in Yorkshire, a royal stronghold where they hoped to find protection. Their hands were still stained with blood, their souls marked forever by an act that would echo through history. Behind them, they left a king who would soon learn the terrible consequences of unchecked anger, a church that had found its most powerful symbol of resistance to secular authority, and a murdered priest whose spilled blood would change the course of medieval history. Argentan, Normandy, January 1171. The news reached Henry II on New Year's Day, as he held court at his castle in Argentan. A breathless messenger delivered the tidings that would forever alter the king's reign and legacy. "The Archbishop is dead, your Majesty, murdered in his own cathedral." The crowded hall fell instantly silent. All eyes turned to Henry, whose face drained of colour. "By whose hand?" he demanded, though some would later claim he already knew the answer. "Four knights, sire, Fitzurse, de Morville, de Tracy, and Le Breton." Henry stood motionless for a long moment. Then, with a cry that was described by witnesses as more animal than human, he collapsed into his chair, tearing at his clothes and hair. "No, no, no," he moaned. "Thomas, Thomas, what have they done? What have I done?" For 3 days, the most powerful man in Europe was shut himself away, refusing food and company, merging only to attend Mass. When he finally allowed his counsellors to approach him, he was a changed man, haggard, subdued, haunted by the knowledge that his words, however misinterpreted, had sent 4 knights to Canterbury with murder in their hearts. "I never wanted this," he told William de Mandeville, his voice hollow. "Christ's eyes, I never wanted him dead." "The world may not believe that, sire," de Mandeville replied gently. He was right. Even as Henry grappled with his own guilt, accusations were flying across Europe. Pope Alexander III, upon hearing the news, reportedly wept openly before ordering all church services in England suspended. King Louis VII of France, Henry's lifelong rival, loudly proclaimed that not since the crucifixion of Christ has such a crime been committed. Most damning of all were the letters arriving from Rome, threatening Henry with excommunication, the very fate that had befallen the bishops whose cause the murdered archbishop had championed. "They call him St. Thomas already," de Mandeville reported. "The monks say his blood works miracles. Pilgrims are flocking to Canterbury." Henry stared into the fire, seeing in its flames the face of the man who had once been his dearest friend. "And what of the knights, he asked. "In hiding at Knaresborough, awaiting your Majesty's instructions." "Let them rot," Henry spat. "They have destroyed themselves and nearly destroyed me." Canterbury, March 1171. Spring came early to Canterbury that year, as if nature itself hastened to bring new life to a place marked by death. Within the cathedral, a strange transformation had occurred. The spot where Becket fell had become the holiest ground in England, roped off and guarded day and night by monks who collected the pilgrims' offerings that poured in from across the country. The first miracles were reported within weeks of the murder. A blind man regaining his sight after touching a cloth soaked in Becket's blood. A crippled woman able to walk after spending a night in prayer at his tomb. A leper whose sores vanished after drinking water mixed with a drop of the martyr's blood. Each new miracle drew more pilgrims, and with them came offerings, coins, jewellery, precious objects that soon filled the cathedral's coffers. The monks carefully recorded each miraculous healing in a large ledger that would eventually contain hundreds of entries. "It is as if his power has grown greater in death than in life," observed Brother William, who had been appointed to oversee the growing shrine. "Those who opposed him in life now kneel before his memory." Indeed, several of the bishops who had stood against Becket now made public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury to beg forgiveness at the spot where he fell. The excommunicated bishops fled to Rome to seek absolution directly from the Pope, no longer trusting in the king's protection. Most astonishing of all was the reaction of the common people. Thomas Becket, who had been born to a merchant family and risen to the heights of power through intelligence and ambition, had become a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Songs about his martyrdom were sung in village squares, crude paintings of his death-adorned church walls. Mothers named their newborn sons Thomas in unprecedented numbers. For King Henry, isolated in his Norman castles, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The interdict on church services had not yet been formally imposed, but it loomed like a sword over his head. His enemies in France and Scotland sensed weakness and began probing his borders. Even his own sons, watching their father's authority crumble, started manoeuvring for position and power. Something had to be done. Avranches Cathedral, May 21, 1172. I swear that I neither ordered nor desired the death of Thomas Becket, and that when I heard of it, I grieved more than I rejoiced. King Henry II, ruler of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, knelt on the stone steps outside of Avranches Cathedral, stripped to his shirt and breeches, repeating the oath demanded by the papal legates who flanked him. A crowd of thousands watched in hushed amazement at the spectacle of Europe's most powerful monarch brought low by the memory of a dead priest. "I further swear," Henry continued, his voice carrying clearly across the cathedral square, "that I will maintain 200 knights in the Holy Land for a year, that I will take the cross and go on crusade for 3 years unless the Pope grants me dispensation, that I will not hinder appeals to Rome in ecclesiastical cases, and that I will restore all properties and rights of the Church of Canterbury as they were before Thomas Becket's exile." The terms of Henry's reconciliation with the Church had been brutally severe, a public humiliation designed to demonstrate that no ruler, however mighty, stood above God's law. Yet Henry had agreed to everything, driven by political necessity and, some claimed, genuine remorse. As he rose after receiving absolution, Henry winced visibly. The previous night, in a private act of penance witnessed only by a few monks, he had submitted to a scourging, receiving lashes on his bare back from every bishop and abbot present. "Is it finished?" he asked Cardinal Albert, the Pope's representative, as they entered the cathedral for the formal ceremony that would lift the threat of excommunication. "The Church is satisfied," the Cardinal replied. "Whether God is satisfied, only he knows." Henry's jaw tightened momentarily before relaxing into a diplomatic smile. "Then let us pray that he is merciful to all sinners, especially kings." Canterbury Cathedral, July 12, 1174. The final act of Henry's penance came 2 years later, during the darkest period of his reign. His sons had rebelled against him, supported by his estranged wife Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis of France. Parts of England were in open revolt, and Scottish invaders had crossed the northern border. In this desperate hour, King Henry II returned to England and made a pilgrimage that would become as famous as Becket's murder itself. Leaving his horse at the outskirts of Canterbury, the king walked the final miles barefoot over rough roads, his bleeding feet marking each step toward reconciliation. Dressed in the simple woolen robe of a penitent, uncrowned and unadorned, he approached the cathedral that had witnessed history's turning point 4 years earlier. Inside, he made his way to Becket's tomb in the crypt, now adorned with offerings from across Christendom. There, Henry did what would have been unthinkable in life. He knelt before his former friend and adversary and submitted himself completely. The monks who witnessed it described how the king lay prostrate on the cold stone, weeping openly as the Bishop of London recited the ritual of absolution. Then, one by one, each monk present struck the king's shoulders with a ceremonial rod, 80 lashes in all, willingly received. Throughout the long night that followed, Henry remained at the tomb in prayer and contemplation. What thoughts passed between the living king and the dead archbishop none could say, but when dawn broke, messengers arrived with extraordinary news. The rebel forces had been decisively defeated at Alnwick, and the Scottish king captured on the very day Henry had begun his penance. "A miracle," the monks whispered. "St. Thomas has forgiven the king." Henry himself made no such claim, but as he rose stiffly from his night-long vigil, his expression was that of a man who had found, if not forgiveness, then at least a kind of peace. "In life we were divided," he reportedly murmured at the tomb before departing. "In death you have conquered." Canterbury, 1220. 50 years after his death, Thomas Becket's remains were moved from the crypt to a magnificent shrine in the newly rebuilt East End of Canterbury Cathedral. The translation ceremony, presided over by the Archbishop in the presence of the young King Henry I, marked the final elevation of Becket from murdered prelate to England's most beloved saint. The shrine itself was a wonder of medieval craftsmanship, adorned with gold, silver and precious stones, surrounded by stained glass windows depicting the life and death of the martyr. Above it hung the Becket's blood-stained vestments, preserved as sacred relics. Canterbury had been transformed. Once merely an important ecclesiastical centre, it was now the premier pilgrimage destination in northern Europe, rivaling Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The The town itself had grown wealthy on the trade brought by pilgrims, with inns, souvenir shops and guide services flourishing in the narrow streets leading to the cathedral. Each year on December 29th, the feast day of St. Thomas, special services commemorated his martyrdom. The monks would chant the antiphon that had become associated with him. For the law of his goal he engaged in combat unto death. For the descendants of those involved in the murder, the legacy was more complex. The families of the four knights found themselves social outcasts tainted by association with an unforgivable crime. Legend claimed that the bloodline of each knight withered within a few generations, divine retribution for their sacrilege. As for the lineage of Henry II, the curse of Becket became a popular explanation for the misfortunes that plagued his sons. The early death of young Henry, the imprisonment of Richard the Lionheart, the disaster of King John's reign. When John's son Henry III proved especially devoted to Becket's cult, many saw it as an attempt to finally break the curse that had haunted the Plantagenet dynasty. Canterbury, 1538. The shrine of St. Thomas stood for over 300 years, growing ever more elaborate and wealthy. Countless pilgrims had worn smooth depressions in the stone steps leading to it with their knees. Countless prayers had been whispered in its shadow. Then came another Henry, the eighth of that name, with his break from Rome and dissolution of the monasteries. For this Tudor king, Becket represented everything he opposed: papal authority over national churches, clerical immunity from royal justice, the elevation of church law above the crowns. In a symbolic act that resonated with historical irony, Henry VIII ordered the complete destruction of Becket's shrine and the removal of his name from all service books. The royal commissioners who carried out the order approached Canterbury with grim purpose, bringing with them a formal document that now stands as one of history's most extraordinary legal proceedings, the posthumous trial of Thomas Becket for treason against his rightful king, Henry II. Finding the long-dead archbishop guilty, they emptied his shrine of its treasures, requiring 26 carts to transport the gold and jewels to the royal treasury. The saint's bones were allegedly burned and the ashes scattered, though persistent rumours claimed that monks had substituted other remains and hidden Becket's true relics. Where the magnificent shrine had stood, Henry VIII ordered a plain stone floor laid. No marker was permitted, no acknowledgement that England's most famous saint had ever rested there. Yet even this second king could not entirely erase Becket's memory. The stained glass window survived, though damaged. The spot where he fell was still known, though no longer formally venerated. And in the cultural memory of England, the story of the murder in the cathedral remained indelible, a caution against both royal overreach and clerical ambition. Today, a simple modern altar marks the place where Thomas Becket fell on December 29th, 1170. Above it hangs a striking modernist sculpture, a pair of intersecting swords representing the weapons that struck him down, with the broken tip of a sword symbolising the blade that shattered against the cathedral floor during the fatal assault. Nearby, a single candle burns continuously, the flame a living memorial to a man whose death changed the relationship between church and state in medieval Europe. Visitors speak in hushed tones here, as if the centuries-old bloodstain might still be visible on the worn stone floors. Historians still debate Becket's true character and motivations. Was he a principled defender of church independence or an obstinate troublemaker? Did he seek martyrdom or merely stand firm for his beliefs? Was his transformation from worldly chancellor to ascetic archbishop genuine conversion or calculated ambition? Henry II remains equally complex. A brilliant administrator who laid the foundations for English common law, he was also a man of ungovernable temper whose worst impulse led to his greatest regret. Did he truly desire Becket's death? Or was he merely a victim of his own incautious words? Perhaps most remarkable is how their personal drama, a friendship turned to enmity, a dispute over principle that ended in violence, came to symbolise the large conflicts of their age. In their individual story, medieval Europe confronted the essential questions that would shape civilization for centuries. Where does the authority of the state end and that of religion begin? What are the limits of power even for kings? What principles are worth dying for? Outside the cathedral, modern pilgrims still arrive daily, following the ancient pilgrimage routes immortalised in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. They come not only from England, but from across the world, some religious, some historical enthusiasts, all drawn by the powerful story of what happened here nearly a millennium ago. For in the end, the murder in the cathedral transcended its immediate circumstances to become something universal, a story about power and principle, of friendship and betrayal, anger and remorse, violence and redemption. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of events, but a tapestry of human passions and choices whose consequences echo far beyond their time. On the spot where Thomas Becket fell, where his blood once stained the cathedral stones, visitors sometimes leave small offerings, a flower, a written prayer, a token of remembrance. And in that simple human gesture lies perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this ancient tragedy. Its ability to still move us, to still prompt reflection on the eternal questions of loyalty, conviction, and the price one might pay for standing firm in one's beliefs. As a medieval chronicler wrote in the years following the murder, they killed a man, they created a legend, and the blood never truly left the stones.